Unmute yourself, Mustafa. Unmute yourself.
Mustafa, Steven, whichever you're comfortable with.
Okay, okay. Thank you for being a part of our Chicago Cred Talks. Thank you for taking the time out of your day to talk to us and to give us some background on who you are and who you were and what led you to being and doing the great work that you're doing right now. So let's jump back in. I heard Kanoya Ali say that you were one of the first juveniles convicted and sentenced to life, right? And so sometimes I know when I was coming up, it was a lot of guys that were saying that they were given juvenile life, but you know, that meant that they would be out at the age of 21. Is that the same thing in your case?
No, sir. No, sir. Back in 1983, I called a case. And back in 1984, when I was convicted, they had just came out with the when you had a multiple murder, that it was a mandatory life sentence. There was no discretion that the judge could exercise or anything in that nature. And back then, I was convicted of 4 counts of murder, and I was given a mandatory natural life sentence without the judge's discretion. Jury. If I was convicted, that was it. There was nothing else could be done about it.
So you were given a life sentence without the possibility of parole. So that meant the rest of your natural life at the age of 15 or 16.
I called the case at 16. I had just turned 17. So I had been arrested. I had been locked up since I was 16 years old.
So we got that part, and we'll get back to it. So let's regress a little bit. Let's go into who was Stephen, even though you were locked up at such a young age. Who was Stephen Hawthorne in his adolescence?
Well, basically, I was born over there on the south side of Chicago in the Stateway Gardens housing projects. Raised up over there all my life. And at that time, Stateway, Bronzeville, and Cabrini Greens had the highest murder rate in the city at that time. And, you know, you can grow up in an environment of that kind of nature and it becomes normal to you and so forth. So as a child, I always thought everything was normal. This is the way it was supposed to, because that's all I was ever exposed to. And it took many years to realize that basically this was an abnormal and dysfunctional environment that one was raised up in. But it wasn't just me, it was just all the kids that was over there. You know, so as I sit back now and talk with older guys, it's a surprise when you think about it, when you look around the neighborhood and you try to figure out who made it and who made a success of themselves, and really nobody did. You know, usually you have a great basketball star, neighborhood baseball player, athlete, or something. It was like our generation, there was nothing.
So you say you were born and raised in the Stateway Garden housing projects. Yeah. Could you give our listening audience and also those who are viewing like an overview, if you could describe it in terms visually, what would that look like?
It went from 39th to 35th, 8 buildings, real concentrated. Because, you know, most projects, 17 stories, everybody stacked on top of one. Everybody knew one another. You know, it was a different time, you know. And it was just an active environment on all fronts and so forth. And in saying that, what I mean by that, you had every element there. You had people that were trying to be positive. You had families there, but you also had a negative element. And it was interwoven together, and it just moved like a perfect storm, so to speak. You know.
So what was your family structure? Siblings, brothers, sisters?
Only child, and as I was talking earlier today, I'm starting to figure out that I might have a brother and a sister. But because coming up, I was only child, and my father was in the life. You know, he was one of the original founders of the Black Gangsters. He was the original Black Peace Stone Royal family. My mother, you know, she was in the streets. You know what I mean? You know, she lived a fast life. You know, and that was common around the household. You know, basically just growing up, it was, you had to be a stand-up guy, so to speak. You had to stand your ground. It wasn't that I could come home and I had this problem, I had problems. It was like, if somebody hit you, somebody did something to you, you have to hit them back. That was just the environment. And it wasn't just for me, it was just for everybody. You couldn't be weak, or what looked at as weak, or you would be a victim.
So you said that that your mother and your father were involved in the streets. Could you explain that a little more? I know exactly what you mean by that, but if you can dive into that just a little bit more for the people that are watching.
Yeah. As for my father, he was one original Blackstone Ranger, and he had sectioned off and started what was called the Royal Family, which is one of the founding members of what's considered now New Breeds. They were originally black gangsters and so forth. My mother, she grew up around there. She was in the streets of Egyptian Cobra, and they were kids, and this was common, and my father, over time, in and out of prison, I never really had a connection with him. My mother, they separated and went their separate ways. She was a teenager when she had me, and basically he ended up going to death row for multiple murders and stuff like that. And my mother just moved on with life like most people do, and she married and tried to give me what she knew how to give me as the best life possible, But, growing up in the projects during that time, it's only so much that, a mother can provide. So I learned from the streets. The streets was my parents, and stuff like that of that nature.
Yeah, so I was just about to get to that. So you're saying with your father, who was on death row, that means he was also sentenced to die in the penitentiary, right? And then you say your mother, she was doing something a little different as well. So who were your main or key influences when you were coming up before you caught your case?
I would say my strongest influence was, as far as bloodline family, was my grandfather, my mother's father, and he was a war veteran, fought in the Korean War. Unfortunately, he went to prison himself for 2 counts of murder and so forth, and came home, and basically but I always was around my mother, my grandfather, and their friends. I never really hung around people that was of my age group. I never connected. Being the only child, my mother was no babysitter. So if she went out and she was at the bar, the clubs, or whatever, I was there with her. If she went, I can recall times when she might be out at friends' house at party, and I would be the only child there at 2, 3 in the morning, So it was like there was no real childhood for me, in that sense.
Did you go to school, Stephen?
Yes, sir. I went to Christmas Addicts, went to Phillips High School, played football, amateur boxer, Golden Gloves and stuff like that under Leroy Murphy, who was a former cruiserweight champion. He was my trainer, team coach and stuff like that. I wasn't a great student. I can say I wasn't a good student at all, because when I went to prison and they graded me, I had a 4th grade math level and a 5th grade reading level. But back then they had a thing called social passing. So they didn't hold you back. So you didn't really have there was no great expectations. You went to school, and as long as you was there, they would pass you along. But
so who were your street influences? We know your grandfather, you hung out with your mother a lot. So when it comes to like the street life, and I guess there's something that you had got caught up in, who were your influences there?
Well, at that time, with my family and their connections to these street organizations that we have, I knew Booney Black, Moto. I knew the Fluky Stokes and all those at the time, the CWs. And basically at that time, during the street games, you had different cliques of guys, like out on 95th US, Shorty Freeman. I knew all these people personally. I grew up around these people. a lot of Jeff Ward's people and stuff like that. So I'd always been around those kinds of players in the game, you know, as well as neighborhood guys like Narvell O'Neal and Clean O'Neal, and so for the Dale Vikings, the leaders of the Dale, founders of the Dale Vikings and stuff. It was just that kind of environment. It was long time before a lot of those people started going to prison for extended periods of time.
So which street organization did you say you would have had the most involvement with before you were convicted?
In my neighborhood, it was primarily GDs and Dale Vikings, but I had always been connected with my own people, Black gangsters.
So at a very, very young age, it seemed like you were into a lot, you know, not some of it not by your own, but, you know, just your relatives, your family members, and your friends. And again, you said that you caught this case at 16 years old. So I was doing some reading, right? And I came across an article, and this is what it said. It said, teen, 16 years old, found guilty for killing 2 people over a bag of potato chips.
Yes, sir.
So when you hear that, or when I read that, you know, the first thing that I thought was either, you know, they sensationalizing it, which I know that, you know, that they can do, or this guy at 16 was a real hardened criminal, right? Could you give me some background, if you will, if you don't mind sharing with us? Is this what happened? I
Absolutely
mean,
not.
as quick as you can get to the point and the circumstances around it.
The circumstance around that whole case was, in 1983, there was a lot going on. And I was real heavy into the streets, real heavy, at 15, 16 years old. I had been previously locked up I was in and out and so forth. This gentleman that I had the case on, James Barnett, me and him had a prior history, a violent history. And actually, it was not about, the man had never robbed, he had never took no corn chips. This was about a young man, a friend of mine was sleeping with his girlfriend, and there was a fight that broke out. Fight broke out, not with me and him, but with my co-defendant I had at the time. The co-defendant ended up winning the fight. He seen me the next day. He approached me, shot at me multiple times. I went back, got a gun, seen him, and basically he didn't know I had a gun, came at me with a knife, and I ended up shooting him multiple times. Mr. Lindsay got struck by a ricocheting bullet. The other organizations, G's, that I was into it with, they came and testified and pointed me out and said that, put forth this theory that I killed this man about a bag of corn chips, because they didn't know what happened. But I had a prior history with them. That's why I'm here today, because the people who were actually with him wrote affidavits. We all ended up, ironically, in prison, all doing natural life, and they came forward and told the truth. And with the Miller decision, that played a role, and that's why I was the only juvenile case that they came to negotiate, because they knew the theory that they used was not the theory of what actually happened.
So 2 things from that particular statement. So, you know, some folks, you know, don't or are not guilty, right? I heard you say that you did, in fact, shoot someone, right?
Yes, I did.
And then the second thing that I heard was the Mr. Lindsay. Was Mr. Lindsay the guy who was somewhere playing chess?
Yes.
So were you trying to shoot Mr. Lindsay, or how did Mr. Lindsay lose his life, if you don't mind sharing that with us?
They said Mr. Lindsay had got shot by a ricocheting bullet, but nobody ever said that I actually shot Mr. Lindsay.
So so what was going through your mind? Because you said that you had and I'm sure that this came up at your trial. I'm not a lawyer or anything like that. So what was going through your mind when you say that you had did you have the opportunity to leave and to go and get a gun? Is that what I heard?
He was shot the next day, the following day, that following night, basically.
So was there anyone that you had confided in or asked, is this something that I should do, or was this just something that you felt that you would? And you know, in today's, and I'm sure you know, like today, a lot of folks, when they feel disrespected, that's the first thing that they go to is get a gun. So is this what happened in your case, or was there something else?
I don't know what type of language that we can use if we can be actually blunt with this audience. And so, am I allowed to be blunt? Exactly what happened?
As long as you're not disrespecting any women, we're okay.
Absolutely. Okay, fair enough. The day after he had shot at me, I was at a friend of mine's house and on 55th and King Drive. Him and the same person, him and a guy named Stephen Barnett. I don't know if legally we can actually say their names and so because he's still alive and so forth. They came out to the house and they seen me. And they said, don't worry, we will get this bitch later. Now, I hear that word used a lot now, very loosely with me. But back when you couldn't use that word. And it was something that really struck at my core when he said that. We'll get this later. They'll catch him. And I knew this guy's background. He wasn't nothing to play with, you know, so it was no secret of who I was dealing with. And that set me off because now ego, pride, all this stuff is in the way. I've been shot at before. That really wasn't a major issue, like strange and sadly to say at that time. But that kind of like set me off. So when I came back, he was on the basketball court with 6 of his friends, 6 fellow Dale Viking members. And I sat there and I looked at him and I walked off. I literally walked away. He didn't know. I didn't say a word to him. I walked away, walked off the court. And that's when he's like, bitch, we knew you ain't on S and all that, you know, the verbal. And I stopped and I looked at him. And he told a girl that I had grew up with from kindergarten, went to grammar school with. Her brother was my best friend, who he was dating, who the whole fight actually started over, to give him a bag. And then when she gave him the bag, and he come out with a knife and he walked up because he was with his friends. He wasn't expecting me to have anything on me. Mm-hmm. And then that's led to his death. When he walked up on me, I shot him. And I said, and it was like you pointed out, it was pride, it was ego, and it was a reaction that I'm going to prove to the world that you can't do this to me, you know, that you can't talk to me like that, you know. And it was and that's a mistake many youth make, you know, it's reactionary, you know. And
so obviously, you know, you however you were detained and caught, did you know at 16 years old for a double homicide what kind of time you would be looking at?
Not before I caught the case, but once I went to court, they made that very clear. If I was convicted, I would be given natural life.
So now you're convicted, standing up in front of the judge. I don't know who else was there. Was any of your family members there?
Just my mom.
Your mom was there. Your mom was there doing trial. And the judge says that we the court, or we the jury, find you, Stephen Hawthorne, guilty of 2 counts or 4 counts of first-degree murder. What goes through your head?
Actually, I was numb. I mean, it wasn't like I was shocked. It was a blank feeling. It wasn't like I cried. I actually didn't even cry about it until almost like 4 years later. I was just numb to it, honestly, you know. I don't think I even realized the magnitude of it at that time, you know. Actually, I was so far gone that what really ran through my mind was, one ain't gonna be able to have sex no more. That was how far aloof that I was from the reality of the situation. And I'm putting that in the clean version of what went through my head when I looked at it, you know.
So did you have a chance to either see or speak to your mother after you were convicted?
Absolutely, yes, yes.
And what was she like? I mean, I know that had to be hard to see her son given natural life.
At that time, I think it was pain because I'm her only child. So I know, and we were like more like brothers and sisters than a mother and son, you know. So I know it was painfully hard, but she has always kind of, for the most part, remained strong because she was healthy at that time, you know, before she passed the cancer. You know, she was in relatively good shape, you know. So that was my support system there, you know. So she was there.
So I believe I heard in a previous interview, and correct me if I'm wrong, that your mom was attacked because of the case that you were convicted of.
Yes. After I wasn't caught until almost a week later, and I was back and forth in Stateway, and I was confronting people that was associated with Mr. Barnett and so forth, and everybody knew our history, and everybody, well, it was like a train wreck about to happen. When I would confront people, you know, people would talk, but when I would confront people, they were like, well, we knew this guy was doing this and that, and it was bound to happen. But at that time, I was in a place mentally where only thing that was on my mind was hurting him or anybody that was associated or that wanted to be a part of him, sadly to say. So when I got arrested, about 11 days after they actually caught me and news got out that I was captured, my mother was going to the store one night, and one of his fellow street organization associates stabbed my mother 11 times and almost killed her.
Mm. So when you got the word that your mom had been brutally attacked and stabbed 11 times, how did that make you feel?
I've always tried to live in that life. I can say I was a true believer, sadly to say. And I always tried to live by a certain code that you didn't do this, you didn't do that. But when that happened, there was no code no more. I was like, and sad to say, the best thing that happened to me was I didn't get out shortly, because I wouldn't be doing this interview with you today.
And so, you know, a lot of guys, you know, I too can attest to that sometimes, you know, I'm not saying that it's the route that anyone should take, but being incarcerated is a blessing in disguise. So now you're 16 or 17 years old. You've been given a life sentence, right? So now it's time to do this life sentence. Where's the first place that you go? So are you at a juvenile facility, or are you at an adult facility?
I'm in Menard. I went to Joliet, which usually they keep very young inmates. The youngest, it was like a protective custody. If anybody know about Illinois prisons, back in the early 80s, Joliet was like the protective custody institution. I was in Menard Correctional Center. I was the youngest inmate in Menard Correctional Center in 1984. At 17 years old.
So you were the youngest inmate in the
maximum security prison.
And so what's going through your mind, right? I'm not seeing no guys my age. I'm sure some folks there that you know, but they're not 16 or 17 years old.
Absolutely. You know, straight. The sad, I mean, it's a sad reality, and I don't want to endorse it, but when I went there, it was no real shock. I tell people that I talk to, I was incarcerated long before I was ever went to the penitentiary. And
so stop right there. Yeah, just speak on that. What do you mean by that?
Coming from the projects, in a project in a penitentiary has so many similarities. Concrete, steel, blacks stacked on top of blacks. You're going to have family there. You're going to have friends from the neighborhoods there. It was like, it really didn't affect me in a way that I think it would have affected the average person. I mean, when I went there, it was like, okay, I see my street organization guys, they knew of me, and some knew me by my father, because I was down there at the time when Nissan was there, who was a founder member, King Ram, King Ball, all of them was there. So it was like, he's straight. So I can say I walked around that institution for the year and a half I was there before I transferred. And I never even had to carry a knife or nothing. I just went and worked out, played basketball, went to school for a little while to hang out and kick it. Because at that time in prison, the closer than that, I tell people, it was like the movie American Me. They rolled the doors at 7:30. They closed them at 2:30. They opened them back up at 3:30. Locked them back up at 9:30. You just walked around and did what you wanted to do. You make it through the day.
So I heard you say something that's really interesting. So you said that society, with its social inequities and injustices, with segregation and racism, having you and your families and others in the Chicago housing projects had already prepared you mentally and physically to be institutionalized.
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's deep. So now you're incarcerated, you're locked up. Do you think that you're ever gonna get out?
Absolutely. That was never a thought. The case, because in a strange way, I believed that I should have beat the case because of the way it happened. But people who, legal minds in there that knew the law and looked at the case, my case was one of those cases that lawyers was already trying to get on board on. Judges already read it, they said this wasn't right. Even the judge in sentencing me said he didn't feel I should get this amount of time when the true theory came out of what it was about. He said,
so you would, go ahead, I'm sorry.
So that was never a real concern as I got older and started really realizing the environment that I was in. The key was surviving and living long enough to get out. That became my daily struggle.
You said surviving and living long enough to get out. And how do you do that? How do you do that, Stephen? Being locked up at such a young age, how do you live long? Because I'm sure that some people didn't live long enough, even being locked up, to make it out. So did you actually know any people that were killed while they were incarcerated?
Yes, I knew a few. You know, I knew a few that died of natural causes, that was killed. Anything that could happen in there, I had saw. From staff being murdered to inmates being murdered and everything below that. I think my real challenge came when I left Menard and I went to Pontiac, because each prison has its own personality. Menard was more of a racially segregated institution. That's what most of the bikers in North Siders, which would consider Aryan Nation, that's the best category you can put them in, and the gangs was there. Pontiac was gladiator school. When I went there, that was a totally different animal. That wasn't walking around playing basketball. That's when you wake up, you tie your boots up, you put your knife on you, and you be ready for anything, because it can happen at any time. And that's what I mean, surviving the day. And being there from 85 to 1997, that's why I did most of my seg time, my 12 and a half years worth of segregation time. That's where, sadly, I made the real name for myself as part of the street organization. And that's what that was madness. That was madness. If you're on a scale of 1 to 10, you have to make Pontiac 11.
And what is segregation for those who might not know?
That's isolation, where when you get an infraction, you get rolled up or whatever, they put you there to finish your SEG time, your duration up. It's isolation.
So you did 12 years in
12
isolation.
and a half years.
12 and a half years in isolation.
Off and on, periods of time, 6 months here, a year there, stuff like that.
How do you feel that affected you mentally?
Actually, that's why I got my most peace at, because I knew there I didn't have to worry about no knife. I could actually rest. I could actually didn't have to worry about something happening because I was locked in the room by myself.
You said your mother died. Did she die while you were in prison?
Yes, yes.
And how long had you been locked up before?
I had been locked up. She died in 2003. I was like almost close to 30 years.
So you did about 30 years before your mom died. Were you allowed to go to a funeral?
No, I didn't even ask, because when other family members died, they wouldn't let me go, and I knew because of my history and the way that the IDOC looked at me in the category they put me in, they wasn't going to let me go anyway. So I didn't even ask.
So your mom dies, right? The person who was nearest and dearest to you, you're incarcerated. You've done about 30 years and you can't even say your last goodbyes to her. Did that affect you in any way?
Absolutely. She was coming to see me before she passed. And this was like, she first came down with the cancer in like 99 when she first really got diagnosed. You know, I think she had made her peace, you know. And one of the conversations that we had in Joliet in the visiting room, and it's a profound conversation that we had, but I started really practicing my Islam. She had converted to Islam and started practicing the deen because of me and stuff like that. And because we never went to church. We wasn't a church or religious family, basically, back then. I was never been to church, none of that on the street, you know. And she had made a statement that she wished I was dead because she wouldn't be there to protect me, support me. And, you know, it was like, that's a hell of a statement to make. But I understood it. She didn't mean it in a bad way, but, you know, she's not going to be there. And she didn't feel I had nobody else there because I was disconnected from everybody other than her. But, you know, I had got on my walk in Islam, and, you know, and I understood, you know, because, you know, and that's just, I guess, a mother's love, the way she knew how to love me, you know, and so forth. I think that was just a major fear and concern that she had, you know.
How much time did you do, Stephen?
34 years plus 3 years parole. So technically, I would say, because that's still a part of incarceration, probation period. So 34 years inside, 3 years of parole, total 37.
So 34 years inside, and I heard you say something. So 34 years, who bid it with you for those 34 years? Who was there for you in the 34 years? I heard you say your mom, and I also heard you say that she didn't want to leave you alone. So was there anyone else that walked by your side during these 34 years other than your mom?
Consistent, only her. You know, in there, I met people along the way that I established relationships with, but I was so entrenched with the street organization that was the only ones that was my family. Because that we had, you know, in there. But as far as an outside connection to the world, none. No other family members.
You were the first juvenile in Illinois convicted and given a life sentence. So I'm sure Were there others coming behind you while you were incarcerated?
Absolutely. There were many. It was like a total of 108 of us that had mandatory natural life sentences in the state of Illinois.
But you were one of 108. You were the first one.
I was the first one to be given that sentence.
And so with that happening to you, were you able to start to have conversations with those who were coming behind you, who were young? I'm sure that you saw some of them coming in probably as young as you were when you first were incarcerated.
Yes, and even younger. Yes. So yeah, I mean, as time grew by and I got older and a little more settled and started coming into my right mind, you know, you start seeing these young guys coming in, and even those that were connected to you through the street organizations and just in relationships that you established with a lot of young people, being an old timer, which I always never took kind to pops and old time and all that, you know, but because you never really grow because you lack a lot of experience. So I tell people I'm still like I'm 16 right now, you know, but you learn the ways on how to function in that environment. And I used to try to help guys out and just give them good advice and just talk to them about life, man, and family and what's important, you know, and try to help them, you know, just not make the mistakes and the pitfalls of, you know, running around with knives and doing dumb stuff, because the fight is never over until you're 6 feet under. You can always go. I've seen guys in there that I know personally that came in there with 15, 20 years and doing natural life because they didn't call it penitentiary murder. And they would have been home. You know? So I always try to steer guys to a more peaceful resolution if possible, you know? I mean, the environment is the environment, and sometimes the environment in your past don't let you always make the best choices. You know, a lot of my problems is because I didn't know how to walk away.
Okay.
I was never taught to walk away. You know, a lot of my problems was ego, pride, trying to walk in some footsteps of people that I looked at as role models that were in the street, you know. Girls liked it, the bad guy. The girls liked it, the guys with the nice clothes and the jewelry and the cars and stuff like that, you know. And when you're young, you don't have the life experience or the know-how if you're not exposed. And I was never really exposed to anything other than that, you know.
You're here incarcerated with natural life. You say your father was sentenced to death row, so that means that, you know, during the time of his incarceration, they still had lethal injection, correct?
Yes.
Did you ever run across him while he was
yes,
incarcerated?
Yes, in Pontiac. A lot of the times when I was in SEG, death row yard was right across from segregation yard. And we would talk through the gate for hours and hours.
How was that for you, meeting, you know, or having to establish a relationship with your father, and both of you are under this umbrella that you may die institutionalized?
It was strange because I was actually getting to know him. And actually, I really learned about him through the stories of others. Because as a child, him and my mother, they both went separate ways. So I didn't really have a connection with him on the street. But my mother always had high regards for him. She never spoke ill of him. And she used to always talk. She made sure that I knew who he was, you know. So in meeting him, it was an odd, you know, and it was humbling, because, you know, as I got to talk with him, and he gave me the best advice that he could give me. And it was really how to survive inside. That's really what he knew. That's who he was. I mean, if anybody really know his story, he was definitely not somebody to play with, even in his teenage years. And I think that legacy was something that subconsciously led me to most of the stuff, the troubles and pitfalls that I had. Because, you know, when this is your father, and this is your grandfather, and this is your cousin, and you hear these, what we look at now as negative stories, celebrated, you're like, how do I come home crying with a black eye?
Did your father did he receive lethal injection?
No, he died of cancer down in Menard. Governor Ryan, when he commuted all the sentences, they came off death row, and they put him in Menard.
So while you were doing your time, your mom died of cancer, and then your father died while he was serving his life sentence of cancer as well?
Yes, in 2011.
So when did you know that you were going to get some rhythm? You know, that's the term that we use. When did you know that you were, how long had you been into your bit when you knew that you were going to get some rhythm, meaning that you knew that you were going to get a chance to see the light of day again?
Well, in 2012, Miller versus Alabama, the decision with Brian Stevenson argued, basically when that decision came down, it was my legal argument that I had been arguing since 1984. The Seventh Circuit of Illinois, just the politics of, as we know, the politics of government and time doesn't always follow law, you know, or what's in the best interest of law. But my argument then was, you have given me a death sentence. And if you tell me I got life, I got death by imprisonment. And you cannot give a death sentence without a hearing. This was one of my arguments for 30 plus years. I had basically exhausted all my remedies. So basically the only thing that one could hope for at that time was that something came down the pipeline through the higher courts, the Supreme Court. And just what happened, that did. So I filed a petition, a 214-01, which is a legal argument that you can argue yourself, and submitted it to the courts. And if they would have followed the law at that time, I would have came home in 2012 when that decision came down. But Cook County politics at 26 in California was like, wait a minute, we can't do this, not this easy. So as the court procedures go, the shenanigans come into play. You want to change my petition. You want to give me a public defender. I don't want no public defender. I want my day in court. So the public defender's office contacted Northwestern and said, you got a guy, well, because everybody else had to file to the appeals court. Because I had 29, 30 years in almost. Nobody else had that in under that sentence. And I had used up all my remedies, so I didn't have to file the same procedures as the other 107 had to follow. So when Northwestern came down, I had a corporate lawyer that was helping me out because my mother had passed and left me some land and stuff like that. And basically I thought he was coming, and Northwestern was down there with an old motion. They had one motion, and they was like, I'm looking in the room and these people sitting there, and I'm like, well, who in the H is y'all? I don't know y'all, you know, and because Northwestern had turned me down because they was only doing DNA at that time and stuff like that. So this was something new, and I didn't have a DNA issue. So I sat down with them, and basically they asked me about my case, and I told them, and they told me about the petition that I submitted. They asked, could they see it? I let them see it. They asked me, did I work in the law library? I told them, nope. I said, I know my case. I know where they messed up at. I should have never got no, worst case scenario, I should never got no more than 20 years. Worst case scenario, because of issues in the case. We went back and forth, and they told me they're not going to let you walk in this courtroom, even though you're absolutely right. And we're in this case, not this judge, not that. They said we'll use every resource we have. We won't change none of your nothing. We'll leave every I dotted and every T crossed, but we would like to do the case.
What I did notice, Stephen, is that you said that, you know, that you weren't that good in school, but what I can tell you is that you learned the law. I could just hear it by the conversation, and I believe that that worked in your favor. So you say Northwestern came and helped you. When and how long did it take for you to get a decision?
Basically 5 years of going back and forth, because as I argued, I explained to them the retroactivity of it, Miller versus Danforth versus Minnesota, and all these other cases. There were cases in other states that had to be argued and so forth. So basically, once they went through those procedures, where the Supreme Court was saying everything that I had told them 5 years earlier, then we went, and I finally went back to the county, and it was from there, you know, Anita Alvarez. If we know her history, she's not a negotiator. She's a hardball player. And I was literally, even to this day, I'm the only case that they came and said, can we negotiate? Because I almost had an actual innocence claim of self-defense. So either, and it was like, the lawyer's like, no, when you won.
Yeah.
You know? Because
So
we
won.
was arguing literally about a 9-month window. I'm
Yeah.
like, I'm ready to go now. You know, and they was like, know when you won.
Yeah, so you here with us today. So you won, and we thank you for being one of the forerunners for those who have come after you, for not having to serve the rest of their lives, especially being a juvenile. So you get the information that you're going to be a free man. What's the first thing that goes through your mind?
Well, strangely enough, once I got back, I kind of knew it, so it wasn't much of a shock. But the conversation that I actually had with the students and the people at Northwestern was, I know you're getting me out. I know that all eyes are going to be on me. So what is the purpose of getting me out? Because what I didn't know was, when you get in these type of situations, in there, information is limited. We're not experienced. We don't have the life experience or life skills. So either you become a truck driver, or you become a preacher. You know, the two things that you do when you come home, because it ain't no job. That's what we've been told. That's what we argue. There ain't no jobs out there. They ain't gonna hire you. You've been on. So, and I explained to him about the works that I wanted to do and stuff like that. But it was about, I knew the way to those other 107 in Illinois, I was going to be the poster child. If I messed up, it's going, you give leverage to keep those other people in. And
man, we thank you. We thank you. We thank you. We thank you for, you know, being the poster child and for being the message that you bring. You know, we could talk, man. Me and you could sit here and talk, man, for hours and hours, but you know, we don't have a whole lot of time. And I want some of the folks that's listening and also that's viewing to have the opportunity to ask you some questions. So,
absolutely,
man, on behalf of me and Chicago Crib, and I thank you for taking out this time, for sharing your wonderful and enlightening story, man, and just keep help others. Brother Ali.
Sir, yes, sir, yes, sir. Sherry, can we take it to Darian Barksdale? Brother got a question. Okay. Well, we got one from a question from Peter. What would you say to your 16-year-old self today? Stop.
Put this on vibrate for me. What would I say to my 16-year-old self? to take life
Can you hear me
serious,
now? You hear me?
to take life seriously, because decisions that you make hastily and irrationally can cost you for the rest of your life. You know, I mean, sometimes you have to make hard choices in life, and it's always somebody out there that's trying to, give you good counsel. I had plenty of good counsel out there. I just refused to listen to it. But you have to sit back and, you know, make wise decisions and not live in the moment, but you have to think farther down the line.
Thank you. Darren Barksdale got a question. You got him, Sherry?
I thought that was him.
I was answering y'all question. Y'all asked me a question. You said what I tell myself when I was 16.
No, that was a question to Mustafa that someone asked him. But do you got a question you want to ask him?
No, I thought y'all was asking me a question.
But we appreciate you coming through, brother. We just want to make sure if you have something you can say it. Okay, Mustafa, man, we got a question. So in your situation, young man, his nickname was, what was his nickname?
In my case?
Yes.
Papa. James Barnett.
Papa was a very known guy.
Yes.
And the situation started over what some would say your first encounter with him was because of what?
A young lady went down to that. I had differences with and told him that I was looking for him to kill him. And I really had no idea of who this guy was. I had no previous encounters with him other than living in the same neighborhood, a building apart.
So a young lady that you had an issue with, you had some words with, went and told a guy that you were looking to kill him. You're 16 at the time. How old was he?
I was actually like going on 15.
15.
At the time.
How old was he?
He was like 17 at the time.
And at that time, was there any physical altercation after that when you first met him?
Absolutely. I was down in their building, and he approached me and inquired to me about it, and I'm like, I had no idea what he was talking about. And him and 5 other guys, they jumped me, they knocked me out, and I woke up. I was at home. About 6 months later, I was dealing with this girl, and he was dealing with her niece.
So 1 second, you said you were knocked out.
Yeah.
Out. Right.
Yeah.
These guys jumped you.
Right.
6 guys jumped you, knocked you out, and then you woke up at home 6 months later. That meant you didn't do anything.
No, I let it go. And as our previous conversation, I think that was my biggest mistake. Because he looked me in the face 6 months later and said, the only reason I'm alive today is because 2 other girls that I went to school with walked out the building that night.
So he told you 6 months. So you seen him after he beat you up.
I used to see him constantly.
Yeah. After they jumped you, you didn't do anything, and you seen him later, and he confronted you again. Would you say it was more like a bully situation or not?
Well, yeah, I mean, sadly to say it was, because I tried to avoid it because we were on 2 different things. We didn't even really associate with one another, but we was always constantly in contact with each other because the environment is so small, you know? So I seen him consistently. And sometimes we would be in the same circles. And, you know, that's the kind of guy he was. And his history had came out where people that came and testified for me at the trial, where he had went in their houses and pistol whipped them in front of their families and stuff.
A 17-year-old boy.
Yeah.
So, you know, and I'm stating this only because we got participants that may fall in that range of what's going on, whether it's you or him. And at the end of the day, one of you guys went to prison for 34 to 37 years of incarceration. Somebody went to the grave.
Absolutely.
And it started because somebody else went and told someone something that was not even true.
True. Absolutely. That was the core cause of it. That's where it started at. Our first encounter was a physical confrontation over a lie.
There's a question. It says, and you know, I also want to make this because last week there was some technical difficulties and we got 3 minutes left, but I wanted to make this point. We're looking at a man who went to prison and who was incarcerated at the age of 16. After 34 years of incarceration, he was released from prison. He started to live at our brothers and sisters over at Eman housing program. And he started to manage the housing program. And last week, Thursday, was the first day he had ever moved out on his own in his own apartment. So in 53 years of being on this earth, last week, Thursday, was the first day he had ever lived on his own, in his own place. So the internet situation that really took place was based on the fact he had never had to order internet before. He never done that before, so he thought the process was simpler than what it was. When I found that out, I found it real intriguing, and I was even, it just shows how much you're talking about. A 53-year-old man had never been in a place by himself a full 24 hours outside of solitary confinement. So I think this was a great episode, man. Do you got any last words you would like to say to the people?
Well, I mean, it's a pleasure for me to be here, but this wouldn't be possible if it wasn't for Iman. Without them, I would have never had this platform. For 4 years, on the 4 years, they have been a constant support, teacher, and a family. And it's a blessing for an organization like this to create a platform for me to even be able to talk to you all. So if it wasn't for them with housing, me mentoring these young guys and stuff in the houses and stuff like that, I wouldn't even be a conversation piece.
We know that Eman is a great organization, but I want you to know your value in yourself, and you're a conversation piece. But the man without Eman, with cred, without cred, your life has value. I think this was a great interview. I think you dropped so many jewels and nuggets of knowledge, and I do want to send a shout out to Eman because they do great work, and by them reaching out to guys like you and so many others, I just hope they have a super bright, big future and they can expand more work that they do. Man, thank you again, man. Next week, and this was one, man. This was one, man. This was a real great interview, man. We want to tell you that we appreciate you here over at Chicago Cred Talks, and man, we'll see you guys next week, 3 o'clock, 3 to 4, same time, same place. Be looking out for the email. All right, love you, brother. Salam alaikum.
Assalamu alaikum.
Kirk, great job.